All right, well, good morning. So good to see all of you here today. If you are a guest this morning, again, we just want to say welcome. We are glad that you are here. If this is your first time, or maybe you've been coming for a few weeks, we just want to say we really appreciate you taking a step to come and visit. We know that, visiting churches is not an easy thing, and sometimes can be intimidating and awkward and all of the things that go into going to some new place. So we appreciate that. If there's a way that we can help ease that for you, we would love to do it. Myself or our staff or anybody with an orange lanyard can answer questions for you or help you take a next step. So please let us know if there's anything we can do to serve you. One thing that you could do is there's a card in the back of the chair in front of you. It's called a First Step card. If you feel comfortable doing it, you can fill that card out. Put the information there that's requested, any needs that you have. You can drop that in the bucket later. You can find somebody with an orange lanyard, hand it to them. They'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Or you can come see me after the service. I would love to talk with you. Another step that you can take, maybe you've been coming here for a little while and are wondering like, okay, what do I do now? Is our Connect class. And we have a Connect class today after the second service, so around 12 o'clock. This is a place where if you just have questions, you want to come and get those answered, you can do that. Or if you're thinking about taking a step into membership, you need to come to this class. So that class will be for you. And we're going to provide lunch. There's Cornerstone Kids available. So again, that will be noon today, right back in this space. We'd love to have you there. Okay, so this morning we're going to continue in this series, as Dustin said, called Immeasurably More. And we've just been thinking about, the way the Bible talks about God's active work in our lives individually, and this work in the world and his work in the church. In Ephesians 3, Paul says that he can do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine. Like God is ready and waiting, actually, to do more through us and in the church and in this world. And a lot of that, though, relies on us doing certain things to allow God to work in and through us. There are practices, right? There are things that we do that allow God to begin to do his great work within us and through us, and even through the church. And so we've been talking a little bit about what those practices look like, and there are 5 of those, and they go like this: radical hospitality, passionate worship, intentional faith development, risk-taking mission and service, and extravagant generosity. And so we've been spending time as a staff and as leadership working through these. We decided that we should preach through these, so that's why we're talking about these each Sunday. We've already talked through the first 2, radical hospitality and passionate worship, and what that looks like for us both individually and corporately as a church to practice those things and how important they are. And so this morning we're going to look at that third one, intentional faith development. Like, what does it look like for us to intentionally do things that help grow this faith that God has given us? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But when I think about just growing things, I think about the fact that I don't have a green thumb. Does anybody here, do you like to grow things? Like, are you good at that? Just feel free to just raise your hand. I'd just be curious to know who you people are, because I may need to come to you later. There's not many of you, or at least you're not willing to raise your hand. So there's that. But some of you are really good. You have a green thumb. Like, you can stick stuff in the ground and, man, it just grows. My wife is actually pretty good at that. Like, she can either make stuff grow or she can keep stuff alive and all that. I'm not nearly as good at that. But I was thinking back to this summer, and we tried to grow some sunflower down at the farm, about maybe a little over a half acre, and so I went online because I've never grown sunflower before, and they're kind of picky. Like, you have to do certain things to get sunflower to grow, and they need a lot of stuff. And so we did everything we thought we were supposed to do, tilled it up. Becky and I went out and hand planted each one of those seeds in that half acre or better plot in rows about 10 inches apart, like, that kind of thing. We're like Johnny Appleseed out there, putting and so we did that, covered it up, we put some fertilizer on it, it rained, it got sun, and so after a couple of weeks we were down there and we noticed green stuff's coming up. That's a good sign. And then, after another week or two, yeah, something's definitely coming up. Like, I thought this was a win and a victory. Well, Wesley, who's our resident agricultural expert, goes out there and looks at it and he goes, "That's not sunflower. That's weeds." So we're growing a massive, mean patch of weeds out there is what we were growing. And it was really so bad that eventually we couldn't figure out. There was some sunflower growing in there, but you couldn't distinguish the sunflower from the weeds, and the weeds had definitely overtaken it after about a month or so. And so basically that was our failed experiment at sunflower, so we'll know better next year. We're going to try it again next year. But so it's just interesting that, it's like it had everything it needed, right? We'd planted the seed, got some good soil in there, and sun, and we had some rain and all that kind of stuff, but what we didn't account for was the weed factor. We should have done something about the weeds before we planted that seed. And so for anything to grow, it needs certain things to happen. It needs that right environment, the sun, the water, and the good soil, and all that to grow. And you also have to pay attention to the weeds. And I think about our own spiritual life is very much the same, isn't it? When it comes to our faith and it comes to really developing that over time and growing that, it just needs certain things that come into our life. We need this word. We need this book that feeds us. We need prayer. We need to be connected to God. We need to worship. We need to serve, all of those things. And why? Because you know what? There's an enemy, and as much as God is growing the good thing in us, there's an enemy growing weeds right alongside that. That's what Jesus said in one of his parables. You got to be careful of those weeds of envy and jealousy and anger and bitterness and all that other stuff that he's trying to take you over with, And so it's important that we intentionally develop our faith, not hope it happens, or just make a New Year's resolution to grow this year and then not do anything. We got to do things. And so we're going to talk about that this morning because it matters to us individually, but it also matters corporately as a church in terms of how we're going to grow and how we're going to continue to reach the world. And so I'd like to go back into Acts chapter 2. So if you have your Bibles this morning, we're going to go back to Acts chapter 2 because when you look at what happened in the early church, you see a group of believers in that first church who were committed to what we're talking about here this morning, to growing their faith. And really, these verses in Acts chapter 2, 42 through 47, actually hold the 5 practices that we're talking about throughout these weeks. So let me first of all read this, and then we'll talk about it in just a minute. So Luke records in Acts the sort of a snapshot of the early church and how they were functioning and what they were doing as a church, and says this. He says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. In other words, they were intentionally devoting themselves to the things that would help their faith grow. 43, everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And then all the believers were together, and they had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This would be a great example of extravagant generosity right there. Verse 46, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. In other words, they were meeting in small groups in their homes, and then they were coming together each week to worship together at the temple or the church of the day. And then it says that they broke bread in their homes, ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. In other words, they understood that worship was a vital part of who they were as a people and what they were called to do. And then the result of that was that they grew. And through their own radical hospitality and opening themselves up to the community around them, people began to come because they looked at what was happening with that group and they said, I want that. I want what those people have. And thousands were coming to become a part of that very first church. And so Luke is recording for us the practices of the early church, the first church. And so what we have there is really, and the reason he included that is, we have a model. We have an idea, a framework of what the church does. What do we do when we get together, and how do we practice this faith that God has given us? And one thing that we also see in here is that early Christians had needs as followers of Christ. They needed to do certain things. There were needs in their life, and that were being fulfilled in community. So I thought this morning it'd be good to just look at the needs that they had back then, over 2,000 years ago, and realize that actually those needs are the same today. The same thing for us as followers of Christ. And the first thing that stands out to me is that they had a need to connect spiritually. That they understood their need both to connect to God spiritually, to connect to each other. That they were more than just physical, they were more than just mental, that they were spiritual beings who were called to connect. And in verse like 42 and in 46, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer. They were devoted to worship. They were cultivating the spiritual part of their life. And what I've found interesting over the years in being in ministry, especially in dealing with people who are not religious, is that even non-religious people know, or many of them do, that there is a spiritual thing happening in them and in this world. Like, at some point, people come to this realization, like, it's more than just about me in this life. Or I'm more than just physical and just mental. Like, there's something else happening. And that is so because God hardwired that into us, didn't he? Like, you go back to Genesis 1:27, and it says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. He created us with his own image, a spiritual sense that was impressed in us. John 4:24 says, God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. You go over to Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. That's a spiritual thing that happens there when we connect with each other on this spiritual journey, that we sharpen each other. And so we know that that is happening because that's a part of us. And when we're not cultivating and developing our spiritual life, we're really missing a whole 1/3 of who we are. And so in that early church, they devoted themselves, it said, like they were passionate. They were excited to grow their spiritual life. And they sat at the feet of these apostles and they learned from them. Because remember, these apostles had seen the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. They had something to say. And the people who sat there were just amazed at the teaching. And they loved it. And they just ate it up because it fed them. And it helped them be who God had called them to be, living in a difficult time and in a difficult place. And for sure, though, the enemy distracts, doesn't he? You know, he wants us to not be concerned about that. He wants to lull us into this sense of, you're good, you're fine, just relax. You got a lot to do. You got a lot of other things to take care of. It's like the story of Mary and Martha. Some of you know this story really well because probably you're more of a Martha than a Mary, so you know this one. But Jesus goes to Martha and Mary's house, his good friends, and he spends some time with them. And so Martha, you know, she's a to-do list. Are you a to-do list person? Like even on your days off, you're doing a to-do. Okay, you get that. And you got to do something to feel fulfilled. And so that's Martha. So when Jesus gets there, she's like, oh my gosh, he's a guest in our home. So there's certain things that we do. So she immediately jumps into the kitchen and she's whipping up some, you know, Tostitos and some dip, and she's getting the Cokes out and she's pouring and putting ice in the glasses and getting everything ready to host Jesus. Meanwhile, her sister Mary, who's not a to-do list person, is just sitting there. Can you imagine? Just listening to Jesus. She's not doing anything in Martha's mind. And so Martha gets upset. She's like, hey, Jesus, would you tell my sister to get in here and help me? Like, I got a lot to do in here to help you. And Jesus is like, power down, Martha. I'm sure he said it just like that. Power down, Martha. He said, listen. You know, Mary is in here actually doing the better thing. And it would be good for you if you'd come in here too. All that will worry about itself. But you know what? You only have me for so long. So why don't you come and sit here and listen to what I have to say? You see, Mary was doing that thing that's so hard for many people to do. She was just being with Jesus. She was just taking it in, everything he had to say. Like those early apostles, they were so hungry for it. She was hungry for everything that Jesus had to say and knew that he wouldn't be with them physically for a long time. How's that going for us? You know, Jesus said that people will not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Father. And isn't that so true? It's not just that we're sustained by what we eat every day, but we got to nourish that soul because our body's not going to live forever. Our soul's going to live forever in eternity. We've got to feed that thing as good as we possibly can. And so Jesus would say, listen, why don't you just connect with me? Connect with me. And some of the best times in my spiritual life are where I intentionally sat down and I pushed everything else away and I read this book and I spent a long time in prayer and praising God and gave him enough time to work in me. And I gave myself enough time to push away the to-do list and the worries and the everything else that's going on in my life so that I could do nothing but focus on him. It's in those moments where God really speaks. And he sort of connects that spirit once again with our spirit. And we need that because that's who we are. Because like those folks in earlier, we all need to connect spiritually. And then I think about this second thing is they also needed to belong. These were people who needed to belong to something and some people and somebody. They were devoted not just to learning together, but they were devoted to community, to being together. It says that they were also devoted to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread, to eating together, to connecting with each other. They had a genuine need to belong because, you know, in that day, as Christians, it was a hostile environment. The Romans didn't like you. The Jews of the day didn't like you. Everybody was against you. It was hard for you to own a business as a Christian. It was hard for you to raise children who would eventually marry somebody if they were outside. I mean, it was like everything was a struggle. And so for them, they needed to be together. They needed to sit around the table with other people who were going, yeah, it's really hard to raise my teenagers. Oh, well, that's me too. Talk about that more. Amen? Anybody? It's hard to raise little children. It's hard to, pick something, be at work with this person that just drives me crazy and they're not a Christian and they're making it hard on me and they're my boss and that makes it worse. Whatever. You get that? You know what I'm talking about? Like, it sure would be good to sit around a table with other people who are also going through that. To find a place where, where we belong. And it's the same thing today. And from the time that we were little children, we wanted to belong. Our children, when they go to school, they look for friends. They look for people. They look for a group. They're looking for a place to belong. We've been doing this all of our life because we have a need to do that. We're really not meant to be lone rangers in this world. God didn't design us that way. He designed us to be together, to do things together. Gosh, even the secular world gets that. Anybody got a Fitbit or an Apple Watch? Anybody use it for what you're really supposed to use a lot of that for, which is fitness? This thing that we do where we get fit, right? I got this Garmin watch. I love that I have it. It makes me feel like I'm in really good shape. It's got a lot of stuff on here that I could do, But one aspect of all of that on these apps is what? Community. They have found out that people will do better if they work out with other people, if you're connected to other people who are suffering just like you are. If you can see online where they suffered through this or they did this, they got up early. Or how about accountability? That's another thing. You do it because dadgummit, Joe got up and he had a goal of 3 miles and he ran 5 today. Well, that makes me mad. Now I want to get up and do that. Or he got up at 5:30 and now he's texting me and saying, hey, did you get up? And you're going, I'm still in REM sleep right now. I'm thinking about donuts and stuff. I'm not even close to that. But there's something good that happens when we do this in community. Or I don't know if any of you are CrossFitters. CrossFit has done a really good job of creating community when you go there to work out. Again, because you're suffering together in kind of a unique way. It's a unique type of suffering, but you're doing it together, right? So there's that situation where we're all tapping into the idea that we all need to be together because it's really hard to be alone. It's especially hard to do your faith alone. There's this old story that I've never forgotten. It's about a guy named D.L. Moody, who was a preacher a long time ago. Moody Bible Institute is named after him, and Moody Church, but he lives up in Chicago. And so one day he was going to visit somebody who was like a prominent Chicago citizen, and trying to encourage them to come to his church. He knew who they were, but they wouldn't come. And so he sat down with him at his home, and they were sitting in front of this fire, and he was talking to him about church, and the man just said, you know what, I just feel like I can be just as good a Christian outside the church as I can inside the church. And Moody just shook his head and kind of looked down at the fire, didn't say anything, and he went over to the fire and he grabbed a coal out of the fire and he just set it outside the fire on the cold hearth And he just sat there watching it, and the guy was looking at him, and he was looking at the fire and the coal and looking at him. And after just a couple of minutes, the glow of that coal completely went to black. And then Moody looked at him and he said, because of that right there. And the man got it. You see, that coal by itself can't continue to produce heat. It won't continue to glow. It needs the rest of the coals and all the heat collectively put together to make it work. And his point was, it's the same way with community. Like Christians who are kind of out there on their own, well, they can be a Christian. It's just hard to do Christian things. It's hard to be strong and have faith and to take steps of courage sometimes. But when we see other people doing it, maybe people who are ahead of us or people who are just doing extraordinary things or people who are whatever, it's like a sense of inspiration happens with us, right? And we're like, golly, I should be doing that. Or I love the way, I need to talk to them more about how they do that. Like there's just something good when we belong to this community of people who are doing the same things together. And it's like here at this church, it's why we provide groups, and we want our children in groups and our youth and our college students and adults of all ages. Like we provide groups so that we can have the place where we can connect. And I just challenge you, if you haven't found a place in community here, let us know. We would love to get you connected and help you find a group and a place to plug in and just know other people and grow in your faith. Because that is a vital part of who we are and what we do. And then just this last thing, we have a need to connect spiritually, a need to belong, but also just, I don't know, this seems so obvious to me, but just a need to grow in our faith. They did. They knew it. They needed to grow in their understanding of how to trust God with their life, of how to genuinely believe Him, and how to grab hold of their faith against all the pagan religions that were out there pressing them and against all the threats against their life as Christians. They needed to grow in order to face the challenges that were happening in that day. Now, would you say that we still have challenges today? And that we still have a need to have a strong faith and to grow in our understanding of God? Like that hasn't changed. It's still something that is a part of who we are. And in our verses back in Acts chapter 2, it says, everyone was filled with awe at the signs and wonders done by the apostles. The apostles that day, they were still able to do miracles, and they did that, and the people watched and were just amazed. God allowed them to do that to solidify them as leaders in the church, and those who had actually been with Jesus, those who were validated as apostles of Jesus Christ. And they looked at that, and they were, it says, in awe. They were filled with awe, not at the apostles, but at God, because of what God could do. And they saw that God could fill up their lives with something that they couldn't get anywhere else. They weren't filled with awe and wonder by anything else in the world. It was filled with something only God could provide. And really, in so many ways, they understood their own brokenness and sin. And today, we get our own brokenness and sin, don't we? Like that sin has sort of created these holes or potholes, if you will, in our life, that something needs to be done with that. I was reading about this thing that happened just so random up in Toronto, Canada, that went viral. Somebody took a picture of this pothole that was on their street, and it was one that had started little, and then it grew. And if you've ever had a pothole on a street that you have to go through every day, you know how frustrating that is. They were deeply frustrated. They kept contacting the city. City would do nothing about it. So they just kept working around it. Eventually, somebody went out and put some things around it so that nobody would hit it. But then one day, this guy was driving down, and he noticed some greenery was growing up out of the pothole. He's like, oh, great, now weeds are growing up out of the pothole. A couple days later, he sees it again. He goes back, he says, wait a minute, those aren't weeds. And he goes and he looks at it, and he's like, those are tomato plants. Somebody had gone into the big pothole and planted a tomato garden in the pothole. So he's like, well, that's kind of cool. Let's go with it. So he starts watering the plants. His neighbors find out about it. They're coming out. They're watering the plants. Somebody else takes some sticks and stick them in there so the plants can grow up. And then the whole neighborhood is fascinated with the tomato plants growing out of the pothole. And they fall in love with it, so much so that they go to the city and say, hey, could y'all hold off filling the pothole? We want to see if these tomatoes will actually grow in this pothole. Now, I really don't know what happens at the end of this story. So there's no big, like, dramatic ending here, except that somebody was quoted in the article as saying, I will not eat a tomato out of a pothole. But anyway, so there's that. But it was just this whole idea of these tomatoes growing up out of the pothole. It just kind of made me think, it's like, oh, man, it's like sin has done that to us, but the good thing is that God puts life in the middle of those dark places in our life and in our heart. We try to fill it with all kind of stuff, don't we? Like, even just happiness. We try to fill our life with just, if I could just be happier. And so we get the next thing, we do the next thing looking for happiness, and what do we find? It never satisfies. So we need to get the next thing and the next thing. What Jesus is offering is something that satisfies, so that we don't have to keep looking. He puts life in those places where it feels lifeless. And that's the place in which we begin to grow in our faith, is when we allow him to do that in us. When we see God for who he is, a God who can change a life, who can turn broken pieces into a beautiful picture. And the fact that he really wants to do that. He wants to do that for you and me. We just have to be open. And we have to put ourselves in a position to grow that way. And we have to commit ourselves, like devote ourselves, like those first disciples. We have to devote ourselves to worship regularly, prayer consistently, reading Scripture daily, serving God. All of those things that we do help increase God's movement in and through our life, and then we just get to see more of him. And we avoid the weeds, and we avoid the sin. And he puts those broken pieces together in our life. You agree with me on this? Tracking with me? You know what I'm saying? And so really, I guess I just want to land with a challenge in terms of your own intentional faith development. Maybe just a question to help us think about that. Like, if I were to ask on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing with your spiritual growth? Like, what would you say? If you were real honest, like, where would you put yourself on that? There's actually a survey of people that they determined that most people would say I'm about a 4 or 5, and I'm stalled. The majority of Christians would say that I'm at a 4 or 5, and I'm stalled. And it's because at some point they've given up those practices. They got too busy. They had so many things going on in their life. They lost it. Those who were able to push through and who could say that I'm at a 7 or an 8 and I'm growing were those who stayed with community, who had other people in their life, one person or 2 other people or a group of people that they met with on a regular basis. It helped them push through those moments when they were stalled in their faith. So my challenge to you is to let God do his work in you individually, to find people to connect with on the journey. Because at the end of the day, if all of us choose to do this individually, then guess what? Corporately as a church, it just gets better for us. And when we grow our faith as a church and we see that God can do so much more, then we'll be people who will take risks and do things that God is calling us to do, to step out, to reach a broken world. Amen? All right, let's pray.